The following podcast may not be for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
In the darkest corners of human consciousness lies a phenomenon that haunts us all. That spine-tingling moment when reality splits and time folds in on itself. We call it déjà vu, that creeping sensation that you've lived this exact moment before, even though you know it's impossible. Or is it? In this episode, we will spiral into the story of a woman who didn't just experience fleeting moments of past life recognition, she lived them. Dorothy Eady died at the age of 3, and when she came back, she brought something ancient with her. Something that whispered to her of Egyptian temple walls and sacred rituals, and a love so profound that it survived death itself, pulling two souls back together across centuries like cosmic magnets. This isn't just another tale of reincarnation. This is the story of Om Sety, the woman who remembered too much. And by the end of this episode, you might just question everything you know about the permanence of death itself. London, 1904. A baby girl drew her first breath in a modest home by the churning seas of England's coast. Dorothy Louise Eady was born to Reuben and Caroline, a lower middle-class couple with simple dreams. They could not know their daughter would become one of history's most compelling mysteries. Little Dorothy's life unfolded like any other child's for 3 years. But on a gray afternoon in 1907, the patter of tiny feet on wooden stairs turned to silence. Then came the sickening thud, the screams, the frantic rush to her crumpled form at the bottom of the staircase. She had suffered from a fall down the stairs. When the doctor arrived, he declared Dorothy Louise Eady dead. But death, as the Eadys would soon discover, was only the beginning of their daughter's story. The clock had barely marked an hour's passing when Dorothy's eyes snapped back open. Her small chest rose and fell with breath that, according to medical science, should not have been possible. She sat up in her bed, alive, but something was different. Her parents, drowning in relief, failed to notice at first. They were too busy praising God or whatever miracle had returned their daughter to them. But as days turned to weeks, a creeping unease began to settle over the Eady household. The child who came back wasn't quite the same as the one who had fallen. Dorothy, who died at the bottom of those stairs, never truly returned. In her place was someone else, someone older, someone who carried memories that no 3-year-old should have. As the years would prove, those memories stretched back, not just decades, but millennia. Most children drag their feet through museums, whining about gift shops and ice cream. But in 1908, 4-year-old Dorothy Eady stood transfixed in the British Museum's Egyptian gallery. Her small face illuminated by an emotion no one could quite name. What happened next would haunt her mother's dreams for years to come. Dorothy moved through the exhibit like someone returning home after a long absence. Her tiny feet carried her from statue to statue, with the certainty of muscle memory. Then, in a gesture that sent chills down her mother's spine, the child began to kiss their feet, an ancient gesture of devotion that no British toddler should have known. Caroline Eady, unnerved by her daughter's bizarre behavior, reached down to scoop her up. The screams that followed echoed through the museum's hallowed halls. But these weren't the typical tantrums of a tired child. Dorothy's words cut through the air with chilling clarity as she screamed, "These are my people. Let me stay with them." Her hands reached desperately toward the stone faces. The other museum visitors stared, whispered, and moved away. But Dorothy kept screaming, her voice carrying the weight of something ancient and unresolved. At that moment, Caroline Eady realized the child she'd lost on those stairs 1 year ago and the one she mysteriously regained might not be the same person. This was only the beginning of Dorothy's strange connection to a civilization that had turned to dust thousands of years before her birth. The museum visit cracked something open in young Dorothy's mind. Or perhaps more accurately, let something ancient seep through. In the nights that followed, while other children dreamed of toys and treats, Dorothy's sleep was filled with visions that seemed pulled from the pages of history itself. Sun-bleached columns stretching toward blue skies, gardens bursting with lotus flowers, and courtyards where incense smoke curled through sacred air. But during her waking hours, things truly began to unravel. The proper British accent she'd been born with began to slip away, replaced by something older that carried echoes of sand and stone. She would break down in tears, begging through heart-wrenching sobs to be taken home, even while standing in her living room. Her parents could only watch helpless as their daughter seemed to drift further from them, anchored to some invisible shore they couldn't see. Then came the hieroglyphics. When shown photographs of ancient Egyptian texts, complex symbols that had puzzled scholars for centuries, Dorothy would casually translate them as if reading her morning newspaper. Her tiny finger would trace the bird-headed figures and geometric shapes, speaking their secrets with the confidence of someone who had written them herself. But a particular photograph triggered the most shocking reaction of all. Her entire body trembled when Dorothy's eyes fell upon the temple of Sety. "That's my home," she screamed to her father, her voice raw with recognition. "I used to live there." Her tiny finger jabbed at the image, pointing to specific corridors and chambers as tears streamed down her face. "That's where I lived. That's where I served." For her parents, it was becoming increasingly clear that the daughter they knew had returned from death's door with something else in tow. Memories of a life lived thousands of years ago in the shadow of the pyramids. Memories that were only beginning to surface. At one point, she was even asked to leave her Sunday school as she began to compare an ancient Egyptian religion with Christianity, and ultimately was expelled from a school for girls because she refused to sing a hymn that's lyrics called for God to curse the Egyptians. By this time, the family was no longer allowed to attend Catholic masses. Though Dorothy said the Catholic Mass reminded her of the old religion. As a teen, Dorothy believed her dreams were connected to Egypt, and she began attending groups that discussed reincarnation and studying everything she could about Egypt. Like a compass needle drawn inexorably north, Dorothy's life pulled her towards Egypt. In 1933, she married an Egyptian man named Abdel Meguid. The newlyweds made their home in Cairo, where the desert winds carried the same ancient whispers Dorothy had heard in her dreams since childhood. But the naming of their son sent shivers through their family circle. Dorothy insisted, with an intensity that brooked no argument, that the boy should be called Sety. Not just any name plucked from Egypt's vast history, but Sety after the 19th dynasty pharaoh, whose temple she recognized in those photographs so many years ago. As a child, she pointed to the temple, crying out that it was her home. She would later claim to have served in this pharaoh's reign thousands of years before her birth as Dorothy Eady. Some might call it coincidence, others might call it an obsession, but for Dorothy, it was simply another thread in a tapestry that had begun weaving itself the moment she fell down those stairs in London 3 decades earlier. And now, with Egyptian soil beneath her feet and a son named after an ancient king, she was finally positioned to unravel the mystery of who or what she was. Names hold power in Egypt, ancient and modern alike. So when Dorothy followed tradition and took the name Om Sety, meaning Mother of Sety, she wasn't just adopting a custom, she was shedding another layer of Dorothy Eady, like a snake, sliding free of old skin. With each passing day, the proper English girl from London faded further into memory, while something far older emerged in her place. Marriages rarely survive when one spouse lives in the present and the other seems trapped between two worlds. While Abdel sought a traditional wife, he found himself married to a woman who spent her nights in mysterious communion with the past. He would wake to find her seated in the darkness, her hand moving across pages with frightening speed, her eyes vacant and unseeing. This was automatic writing, a phenomenon in which words flow from pen to paper, without conscious thought or control. But what flowed from Dorothy's pen wasn't the scattered ramblings typical of such episodes. Her unconscious hand wrote in perfect hieroglyphics, telling stories of temple life, sacred rituals, and a love affair with a pharaoh, all through the vessel of a woman who had never formally studied ancient Egyptian script. Abdel would stand in the doorway, watching his wife's hand dance across the paper, and wonder, was he married to Dorothy Eady, or was he sharing his bed with something that had crawled out of Egypt's ancient tombs? He would soon discover that the answer might be both, or neither. Dorothy had penned 70 pages of perfect hieroglyphics while in a trance state. She called it her spirit guide. Within those ancient symbols lie a story that would prove her the most remarkable case of reincarnation, or the most elaborate self-deception in modern history. But Dorothy wasn't the only one witnessing impossible things. Before their marriage crumbled, Abdel himself reported a sight that would haunt him until his dying day. The translucent figure of a crowned and regal pharaoh sitting at the foot of his bed, like a patient lover waiting. Abdel finally left for Iraq, accepting a teaching position that would take him far from his increasingly strange wife. Perhaps he was running from more than just a failed marriage. Left alone in Egypt, Dorothy surrendered entirely to her connection with the past. Out-of-body experiences became as common as coffee breaks. Apparitions walked through her walls as casually as neighbors, and those 70 pages she had written in trance, they began to tell the story she claimed was hers. A tale that had ended in tragedy more than 3,000 years ago. According to the hieroglyphics in her spirit guide, she had once been Bentrashit, a young priestess whose sandaled feet echoed through the temple's corridors. At 14, she caught the eye of Pharaoh Sety himself. Their love affair blazed like an Egyptian summer, quick and consuming. But Bentrashit had taken sacred vows of virginity. Vows her young mind hadn't fully grasped until it was too late. When she discovered she carried the pharaoh's child, she faced an impossible choice: expose their forbidden love and bring scandal upon the man she adored, or find another way out. In the end, Bentrashit chose to take her own life, protecting her lover's reputation with her final breath. 3,000 years later, Dorothy's hand had transcribed this ancient tragedy in perfect hieroglyphics. A story she claimed was not imagination, but memory. As she walked the modern streets of Egypt, she swore she could still feel the weight of that final decision and taste the bitter herbs that ended her life. Though some vows, it seems, transcend death itself. After Bentrashit's suicide, Pharaoh Seti's grief echoed through the temple corridors like a curse. In his anguish, he made a promise that would ripple across 3,000 years of history. A vow to find her again, love her again, and make right what tragedy had torn asunder. And if Dorothy was to be believed, he kept that promise in the most extraordinary way. In the deep of night, while Cairo slept and jackals howled at the desert stars, Dorothy claimed her ancient lover still came to her. She insisted these weren't the feverish dreams of a romantic mind, but tangible encounters. She described them with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing their morning coffee. The pharaoh, still regal in death as he had been in life, materialized in her chamber like a ghost stepping through the veil of time itself. But these nocturnal visits served a greater purpose than mere reunion. According to Dorothy, he had promised her something more permanent than these midnight encounters. He would make her his bride in the Duat, the Egyptian realm of the dead, where souls wandered like stars in the eternal night. The wedding was planned not in earthly temples, but in the sacred spaces between life and death. To most, such claims would sound like madness, but Dorothy spoke of these supernatural rendezvous with such conviction, such intimate detail, that even hardened skeptics found themselves wondering. After all, how does one explain a woman who could write perfect hieroglyphics in a trance? Who could recognize ancient temples she'd never seen? And who carried with her the weight of a love affair that had ended in tragedy? Perhaps true love is simply too powerful for death to deny. Life has a way of bending towards destiny. By 1936, Dorothy should have been at her lowest point with her marriage in ruins and a young son to support. Instead, she found herself exactly where she had always belonged. In the shadow of the ancient pyramids, breathing in the same desert air that had once filled Bentrashit's lungs. Without so much as a high school diploma, Dorothy walked into the Egyptian Department of Antiquities and did something remarkable. She made herself indispensable. While others spent years in universities learning about ancient Egypt, Dorothy worked as if she were simply remembering it. As a secretary and draughtswoman, her hands moved across papers with the same certainty they had shown during the mysterious automatic writing sessions. The academic world's skepticism melted away in the face of her inexplicable knowledge. Soon, she was not just filing papers, but assisting renowned scholars like Salim Hassan with groundbreaking work. Her command of English made her valuable. Her uncanny understanding of ancient Egyptian culture made her irreplaceable. But it was her contributions to Hassan's excavations that turned whispered doubts into stunned silence. Without hesitation, as if following a map etched in her soul, Dorothy led researchers to discoveries that should have been impossible to find. A temple garden lost to time, and a secret tunnel at the temple's northern edge. These weren't lucky guesses. They were the kind of findings that earned her a special mention in Hassan's prestigious 10-volume report, an honor typically reserved for scholars with decades of formal education. The woman who spoke to pharaohs at night was now helping unearth their secrets daily. With each discovery and verification of her inexplicable knowledge, the line between Dorothy Eady and Bentrashit grew thinner. In 1956, when most would have clung to their prestigious positions, Dorothy made a choice that seemed to defy logic. She left her well-paying job at the Pyramid Research Project for a humble position, but logic had little to do with it. After all, Abydos was nestled in the shadow of Pega the Gap, a mountain the ancient Egyptians believed was a gateway to the afterlife. And for a woman who walked between worlds, what better place to call home? The villagers knew her as Om Sety, following their tradition of naming mothers after their firstborn. But the name carried a deeper resonance in this ancient place, where the temple of Sety rose from the desert like a memory-made stone. This was where she, or Bentrashit, the priestess, claimed to have lived, loved, and died. It was here that she would offer the most compelling evidence of her extraordinary claims. In a test that would become legendary, the chief inspector of the Antiquities Department led her through the temple in total darkness. Standing beneath the ancient paintings she supposedly had never seen, paintings that had never been published or documented. Om Sety not only identified them, but revealed their hidden meanings with the casual familiarity of someone who had walked these halls in another life. But she wasn't finished. She spoke of a hidden library beneath the temple of Sety, its walls lined with scrolls containing secrets of history and faith. She insisted the Sphinx was far older than anyone dared imagine. Most remarkably, she described the temple itself as a sort of time machine, a place where the veil between the past and present grew so thin that she could step through it in her mind, accessing memories that should have been lost to time. Tourists who came to see the temple often found themselves equally fascinated by the Englishwoman who seemed to know its every secret. She became as much a part of Abydos as the ancient stones themselves, studying and sharing her knowledge until death finally claimed her on April 21st, 1981. But death, of course, is where this story both begins and ends. Was that fall down the stairs in London merely an accident that sparked an extraordinary delusion? Or did it crack open a door between lives, allowing Bentrashit to step through time and reclaim her place in the world? Perhaps she was possessed by a spirit that carried memories of the ancient Egypt. Or maybe, just maybe, she was exactly who she claimed to be, a priestess who had waited 3,000 years to return home. The sands of Egypt hold many secrets, and some mysteries refuse to be buried. In the end, Dorothy Eady, Om Sety, or Bentrashit took the truth with her into whatever realm lies beyond death. But she left us with a question that echoes through the corridors of time. What if the boundaries between past and present, between one life and the next, are more permeable than we dare imagine? In the shadow of Pega the Gap, where the ancient Egyptians believed souls could pass into the afterlife, perhaps Dorothy Eady found not just a home, but a gateway between worlds. And perhaps, even now, she walks the temple corridors again, finally reunited with her pharaoh in an eternal realm. So, do you believe in true love, in reincarnation, or in deja vu? Perhaps the better question is, how do we explain Dorothy Eady without them? How do we account for a powerful love that reached over 3,000 years to reclaim its own? When Dorothy finally returned to Abydos, the site of her ancient tragedy, maybe she didn't just find ruins. Maybe she finally found her way home. And perhaps that's the most compelling evidence of all. While memories can be invented and facts can be researched, that bone-deep sense of belonging is something entirely different. Dorothy Eady's story asks us to consider something both terrifying and beautiful. What if true love isn't bound by time? Have you ever felt that inexplicable pull towards another person? That bone-deep recognition that defies logic? Perhaps it's what we call soulmates. Either way, sleep well, dear listeners, and if you feel deeply tied to another, perhaps they are a lost love, drawn to your darkness like a moth to a flame. Hold tight. Some haunting bonds were meant to last forever.